December 1944, Eastern Europe. Snow covered the battlefield like a white blanket. But underneath it were the remains of men, machines, and dreams. The war had already consumed millions of lives. Across the frozen countryside, German and Soviet forces continued to fight for every road, every village, and every bridge. For the soldiers on the ground, maps meant almost nothing. A line drawn in ink could disappear in a single afternoon. And somewhere along that frozen front, a battered Soviet T-34 tank waited beneath a camouflage net. Inside sat 5 men. Their commander, Lieutenant Alexei Morozov, stared through the narrow viewing slit. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years. He had seen cities disappear. He had watched friends climb into tanks that never came back. And now he was beginning to wonder whether there was anything left to fight for. Beside him sat the young loader, Nikolai, barely 19. "How much ammunition?" Alexei asked. Nikolai checked the racks. 8 armor-piercing rounds? A pause. "And 3 high explosive." Alexei nodded. "Fuel?" "Enough to reach the river." Alexei looked toward the driver. Then we reached the river. Nobody asked what happened afterward, because nobody knew. Several kilometers ahead stood a small village called Krasny Bor. It had once been home to farmers. Now it was almost completely abandoned. The church tower had been destroyed. Barns were burning. Snow-covered vehicles lay abandoned beside the road. And beyond the village was the Vera River. The river was frozen. But beneath the ice flowed water strong enough to swallow a tank. The Soviet command believed German forces were retreating toward the opposite bank. Their orders were simple: reach the river before dawn. But there was one problem. German forces had not completely withdrawn. They were waiting. The T-34 rolled slowly through the snow. Its engine growled beneath the freezing air. Inside the tank, nobody spoke. Then Nikolai noticed something. "Commander." Alexei turned. "What?" "Movement." Everyone froze. Alexei looked through his optics. Nothing. Only trees, snow, smoke. Then, boom! The tank violently shook. A shell struck the ground beside them. Snow exploded into the air. "Contact!" Alexei shouted. "Forward!" The driver pushed the engine harder. Another shell screamed overhead. Then a third. Alexei finally saw it. A German tank concealed between the trees. A Panther. Its long gun pointed directly toward them. "Enemy tank!" 11 o'clock. The T-34 swung its turret. "Fire!" The cannon erupted. The shell struck the Panther's front armor, but it bounced away. Nikolai stared in disbelief. Again! The T-34 fired. Another impact. Still nothing. Then the Panther fired. Boom! The Soviet tank was thrown sideways, the interior filled with smoke. Someone screamed. Alexei felt blood running down his forehead. "Status," the driver answered. "Engine still works." "Gun?" "Loading." Alexei looked through the sight. The Panther was moving closer. They had seconds. "Reverse." The T-34 backed toward the trees. "Wait." Alexei watched the German tank carefully. Its turret was turning. "Wait." Nikolai loaded another shell. "Now." The T-34 fired. The shell struck the Panther near its side. This time something happened. Flames appeared. The German crew abandoned the vehicle. Alexei stared at it for a moment. Then he shouted. They continued toward Krasny Bor. But when they reached the village, they discovered something unexpected. A Soviet infantry unit was trapped inside. The Germans had surrounded them, and among the soldiers was a field radio operator, carrying a message from Soviet command. Alexei climbed out of the tank. A young infantry officer approached him. "We've been waiting for you." "For how long?" 6 hours. Alexei looked toward the German positions. "Why didn't you retreat?" The officer shook his head. "We can't." "Why?" The officer handed him a piece of paper. Alexei read it. His expression changed. The bridge over the Vera River was scheduled to be destroyed at dawn. If the bridge was lost, hundreds of Soviet soldiers on the western side would be trapped. Alexei looked at the officer. "How many?" "Nearly 400. Silence. The tank commander looked toward the horizon. Dawn was less than 3 hours away. Inside the tank, the crew gathered around a small map. "We can't fight through the German line," Nikolai said. Alexei pointed toward the river. We don't have to. The driver looked at him. What are you thinking? We take the bridge. Everyone became silent. The bridge was heavily defended. Machine guns, anti-tank weapons, possibly more armored vehicles. It was almost certainly a suicide mission. Nikolai finally asked, "And if we get there?" Alexei looked at him. "Then we keep the bridge open." "For how long?" Alexei looked at his watch. "Until everyone crosses." At 3:17 in the morning, the T-34 started its engine. The village was silent. Snow fell gently from the sky. The tank moved through the darkness without headlights. Behind it, Soviet infantry followed. No artillery, no air support, no reinforcements, just one tank, and hundreds of exhausted soldiers. They reached the first German position. Alexei whispered, "Stop." The turret slowly turned. A German machine gun nest appeared ahead. Fire. The cannon thundered. The position disappeared behind smoke. Soviet infantry surged forward. Then the night erupted. Machine guns opened fire. Mortars exploded around them. Tracer rounds crossed the darkness. The T-34 pushed forward. One shell, two shells, three. The tank's armor began to fill with dents. Then, clang! A German anti-tank round struck the turret. The crew was thrown against the walls. Nikolai fell to the floor. "Nikolai!" No response. Alexei grabbed his shoulder. The young loader opened his eyes. "I'm fine." He wasn't. Blood ran from his forehead. But he stood. "Load!" At 4:11 a.m., the T-34 reached the river. The bridge was still intact, but German engineers were preparing explosives. Alexei saw them. "Faster!" The T-34 accelerated. German soldiers opened fire. Bullets struck the tank. The turret gunner fired. One explosive charge detonated. The bridge shook, but it remained standing. Then a German armored vehicle appeared at the far end. Alexei recognized it immediately. Another Panther. He had only 2 armor-piercing rounds remaining. The Panther stopped. Its gun pointed directly at them. Alexei whispered, "Everyone hold on." The German tank fired. The shell struck the T-34. Smoke filled the crew compartment. The driver screamed, "Engine's gone!" The T-34 stopped. The Panther began advancing. Alexei looked at the bridge, then at the burning engine, then at his crew. "We're not finished." Alexei opened the hatch. "Commander, what are you doing?" Nikolai asked. Alexei climbed onto the hull. He grabbed the external controls. The tank couldn't move under its own power, but the tracks were still functional. He climbed down. Snow reached his knees. Then he disappeared beneath the front of the tank. Inside, Nikolai shouted, "Commander!" Alexei crawled beneath the damaged vehicle. He found the problem. A transmission linkage had been damaged. It wasn't completely broken. If they could reconnect it manually, they might move. But there was one problem. The Panther was only seconds away. Alexei climbed back inside. "Start it." The driver tried. Nothing. Again. The engine coughed. Smoke poured from the exhaust. The Panther fired. The shell struck the bridge behind them. Concrete exploded. Alexei shouted, "Again!" The driver turned the ignition. The engine roared. The T-34 moved, slowly, painfully, but it moved. Alexei looked ahead. The Panther was waiting. Forward! The Soviet tank accelerated. The 2 tanks faced each other across the bridge. The Panther fired. Its shell missed by inches. Alexei ordered, "Fire!" The T-34's cannon erupted. The shell struck the Panther's side. Flames appeared. The German crew abandoned their vehicle. The bridge was open. At 4:46 a.m., Soviet infantry began crossing. Hundreds of soldiers ran across the bridge. Some carried wounded men. Others carried ammunition. The T-34 remained at the center. Its cannon pointed toward the darkness. Alexei watched the road. More German soldiers were approaching. Nikolai looked at the ammunition rack. 2 rounds. Alexei nodded. "Save them?" "For what?" Alexei looked toward the approaching headlights. "For whoever comes next." The first German vehicle appeared. Alexei waited. Closer, closer, fire. The final armor-piercing shell destroyed it. The soldiers continued crossing. But then something changed. The sky began turning gray. Dawn. German artillery opened fire. Explosions erupted around the bridge. The last Soviet soldiers were still crossing. Alexei counted them. 20, 15, 10, 5. Then the final soldier reached the other side. Alexei looked at the bridge. "We're done." The radio suddenly came alive. "All units withdraw immediately." Alexei looked at the damaged tank, then at the river. The bridge was supposed to be destroyed, but the explosives had failed. He climbed out. "Everyone out." Nikolai stared at him. "What?" "Get out." They abandoned the tank moments before German artillery destroyed the bridge. The T-34 disappeared beneath smoke and snow. At sunrise, the survivors reached the eastern bank. Nearly 400 soldiers had crossed, but the T-34 crew was missing. The infantry commander searched the road. Nothing. Then, several hundred meters away, they found 4 figures walking through the snow. Alexei, Nikolai, the driver, and the gunner. They were exhausted, covered in oil, smoke, and blood, but alive. The infantry commander approached Alexei. "You saved everyone." Alexei shook his head. "No." He looked back toward the destroyed bridge. "The tank did." The war ended months later. Europe was changed forever. Villages were rebuilt. Roads were repaired. Bridges were reconstructed. But Krasny Bor remembered. Decades later, an old Soviet veteran returned to the river. His name was Nikolai. He stood beside a small memorial overlooking the water. Someone had placed flowers there. He looked across the river, then smiled quietly. A young boy standing nearby asked him, "Did you really fight here?" Nikolai nodded. "Yes." "Were you scared?" Nikolai looked at the river. "Every day." The boy looked confused. "Then how were you brave?" Nikolai smiled. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid." He paused. "It means you keep going because someone else is depending on you." The old man turned away from the river. Behind him stood a small monument. 5 names were carved into the stone, and beneath them were the words, "They held the bridge." Wars are often remembered through generals, battles, and famous victories. But history is also made by ordinary men who find themselves in extraordinary moments. They don't always know whether they will survive. They don't always understand why they're being asked to continue. Sometimes, all they know is that someone behind them needs time. And on one frozen morning in 1944, 5 men and 1 battered tank bought that time. Their names may never appear in the greatest history books, but for the soldiers who crossed that bridge, they were the reason they made it home. Fade to black. On-screen text. The Last Tank of Winter. An original WWII cinematic historical fiction. Subscribe for more cinematic military stories.